Hi, everyone. It's Gina Grillo, president of the Advertising Club of New York. This is our second webinar this week. We are getting really good at this. I hope everybody is staying strong and positive at home. You can be assured that the club and the Andy Awards are committed to keeping our community connected even while we're so distanced. We have transformed our club into a virtual clubhouse, providing our members a look into how global brands are innovating and pivoting given this pandemic. Today's webinar is a collaboration with one of our corporate partners, Xandr. They see the club as a platform and a community and came to us with an idea for both thoughtful and timely content. We hope that this conversation sparks more collaborations with our partners. Right now, health, wellness, pharma, it's the topic of almost every conversation. We have hundreds of people tuning in, so it is my pleasure to introduce Charlotte Lippman, Senior Manager of Business Intelligence at Xandr, to get the program started.
Great. Thanks so much, Gina. And just to introduce myself, my name is Charlotte Lippman, and as Gina said, I'm Senior Manager of Business Intelligence for Xandr. I focus on analyzing audience consumption patterns in addition to managing our custom research initiatives. I help our teams and clients use insights to inform their strategies, so I'm excited to share some with you here today. So I'm just going to pull up my presentation. Great. So as we head into the summer months, our team has been exploring viewership trends and putting consumer insights into context so that we can help marketers deliver relevant messaging at the right time. And that's really true of any time, whether we're talking about unprecedented, uncertain times or not. We see that by being relevant, brands can go beyond reaching consumers and actually connect with them. So today I'm going to walk you through some new audience insights, share some data from our survey of 500 US consumers, and then tie it all back as to why this is super relevant to the pharma category today. So looking back at the last couple months, we know that since the onset of the pandemic, consumers have been watching and streaming more content across devices. In March and April, we saw increased TV viewership, largely driven by the news. We know that television benefits from live local updates, and in many ways, press conferences were the must-see TV in March. We've seen viewers watching more content on their own time. VOD program views have gone up over the last couple months, with significant growth in the children's movie and children's TV programming genres. At the end of March, we saw average weekly hours spent streaming peak, with viewers spending nearly 9 hours streaming on AT&T TV Now. But as we reported significant viewership increases overall, it was important for us to start looking at how audiences were shifting their time and behavior. So I'm going to share insights on two different audiences that we've been exploring over the past 9 weeks. The first are the sports viewers. In March, we started working with the team at AT&T Labs to understand the shifts among DirecTV sports viewing households. We knew that this group was most affected by the interruption to their regularly scheduled programming. But what was fascinating was despite the loss of live sports event programming, we actually saw that sports viewers were consistently increasing their weekly time spent with television. So we segmented this audience to understand how the most avid sports fans were reallocating their sports viewing minutes. For the last 3 weeks in March, sports enthusiasts who usually average 3 or more hours a day with sports, which seems like a lot of sports to me, they were reallocating half of their sports viewing minutes to news. But in April, and as you see here on this slide, they were reallocating only 1/3 of their sports viewing time to news, with 1/4 of it now split between feature film and sports reality. Growth in that sports reality program viewing can really be attributed to ESPN's The Last Dance and the NFL Draft. So one interesting point to note here is that when we initially started running this analysis, we thought we might see sports viewers tuning into old games or library content, maybe getting nostalgic over some old Super Bowl replays, but we didn't really see that type of behavior. However, now that we have these new marquee sports programs like The Last Dance and the NFL Draft, they are starting to tune back in. And now that live sports programming is starting to make its return, with NASCAR last weekend and golf upcoming, we're eager to see how these shifts continue to play out, and also how sports viewing minutes are reallocated back to sports. So we've also been analyzing binge viewers, and we've defined binge viewers as those watching 3 or more episodes of one program per day. And not only has binge viewing audiences increased since February, but the number of programs being binged has increased. And because it's a matter of personal interest, I have to call out that Friends continues to be a top binge show, with triple-digit increases from March to April. We also see Law & Order, Chicago PD, and SpongeBob SquarePants rank high in binging. So as you can see, people are really leaning into comfort food type content. We're seeing that the majority of binge viewers are returning from the previous month. So 84% of April binge viewers also binged in March, and 54% binged in February, March, and April. And when binge viewers return, they're binging more. They're coming back to binge for more days and binging for more programs per day. On average, a return binge viewer in April binged 5 episodes per day for 3 days. We also see that many binge viewers are returning to watch the same program consistently. So what this tells us is that viewing is really increasing among these heavy television viewers, and oftentimes it's concentrated around the same program, which is why it's crucial for marketers to manage reach and frequency goals effectively. So while it's important that we analyze these shifts across audiences, it was also valuable for us to understand consumer perceptions and how those were driving these new viewing behaviors. So in April, we partnered with the market research firm MarketCast to survey 500 consumers. We learned that 3 in 4 consumers say they now have time to do things they couldn't before. And that really translates to watching a lot of content. During this stay-at-home period, consumers have been catching up on all the content accessible to them across services and devices. And I'm totally not speaking from personal experience. 90% say they're watching 3 or more hours of TV and streaming content a day. 2/3 say they're watching and discovering new shows that they've never seen episodes of before. And when it comes to discovering new shows, they say they're likely to find new shows because they were advertised, although they also say channel surfing and scrolling through their streaming library are sources for discovery. And 62% say they're binge watching. Maybe they're binge watching Friends. Through this research, we also learned that viewers at home together are watching together. 79% of those surveyed said they currently cohabit with friends or family. About 1/4 of those are watching a movie together daily, and 1/2 of those say they're watching the news together daily. So we see news really emerge as a collective viewing experience. The consumers we surveyed say they're accessing content across services at least daily. Consumers have more new media platforms at their disposal than ever before, and no shortage of content and programming to choose from. Most consumers say they're watching TV shows and movies on their streaming services and cable TV platforms at least daily. But when we compare these results to a survey we ran in January, we see that usage is up across the board. Ultimately, 79% of survey respondents say they're watching at least 10 hours worth of programming weekly, and 2/3 say the number of shows they've watched has increased since the COVID-19 outbreak. When we asked what type of shows consumers have been watching recently, we see they're splitting their time pretty equally between comedies and dramas, but young adults aged 25 to 34 are more likely to watch comedies. We also saw that 55% said they missed watching sports on television, and the majority said they were finding other TV programming to replace their time with sports, which validated our analysis of the sports viewers. So when we launched this research, we wanted to understand the context of today. It is a sensitive and challenging time for reaching consumers both thoughtfully and tactfully. Would consumers even be receptive to any type of brand advertising? The answer is yes. Consumers want to hear from brands right now. They say it's important, makes them feel valued and supported. In our 2019 relevance report, we found that consumers generally value advertising, and they agree that it provides them a worthwhile service. They're thankful when ads remind them about something they need. So in this time of crisis, we're seeing those perceptions continue to ring true. Consumers do appreciate brand communications. When asked their most preferred methods for hearing from brands during this time, TV ads and email top the list. We also learned that consumers would like to hear from brands that they don't even anticipate using during the pandemic. So those would likely include hospitality and travel brands. What we see here is that consumers are looking for advertisers to establish a strong brand voice around their response to the current crisis. And the key to that is delivering a relevant message. Consumers want to know how brands are supporting their employees in addition to tips for dealing with the current situation. Also from our 2019 relevance report, consumers reported wanting ads that inform and entertain. Here we see the importance of ads that inform. Consumers are hungry for knowledge. We've seen that with the significant growth in news viewership on television. So they want brands to share news with them as well. Now it's worth acknowledging that relevant information will vary across regions as certain states start to open up and relax some of the current regulations. Ensuring a relevant message will depend a lot on audiences' geography in the coming months. So this is all especially relevant to pharma brands because consumers are highly receptive to pharma advertising right now. According to a study from CMI, nearly 3 in 4 consumers say it's okay for pharma brands to advertise right now. And when it comes to the relevant message that they want to hear, 86% want pharma brands to provide information on how to deal with COVID-19, half want to know how pharma companies are helping, and 47% want to learn about patient assistance programs. So one element to research that I find fascinating right now is the extent to which we're starting to see long-term seismic shifts emerge, and consumer concern over health and hygiene is projected to be a long-lasting effect of this pandemic. In fact, last month, Nielsen reported that consumers find product claims around killing germs, immunity, and disease protection to be far more relevant than claims around naturalness, quality, and sustainability. And here in research from Integral Ad Science, we see that consumers have become even more comfortable with pharma brands appearing near coronavirus content from March to April. And marketers agree. They want to see health and pharma brands near coronavirus content as well. But it's true that even with health and pharma top of mind and contextually relevant, it's a sensitive time to be reaching consumers who are all having individual experiences in dealing with this pandemic. So data can help inform how to strike the right tone and send the right message to the right audience. So when it comes to delivering the right message at the right time, we know that viewers are watching more content than ever before across screens and devices, which presents new and innovative opportunities for advertisers. And so far as reaching audiences at the right time, we know that right now is a good time to be reaching out to consumers, and especially for pharma advertisers with health being so top of mind. But to connect with consumers effectively, we know it all hinges on delivering a relevant message. And we know what's relevant to one audience may not be relevant to another, especially as we consider changes across regions in the coming months as shelter-in-home orders are lifted, but also in terms of different types of viewing behavior and shifts in viewing. So an audience-first mindset is key, which is why data and insights present such a crucial role in driving relevance both today and tomorrow. So to dig a little deeper into that idea, I'll hand it over to Mallory for our panel discussion.
Thanks, Charlotte. Very interesting. Hi, everyone. My name is Mallory Halva, and I'm the Director of Client Partnerships and Pharma Lead at Xandr. Of my 8 years experience in addressable advertising, I've spent 6 of them working exclusively with pharma clients. And over this time, I've witnessed pharma brands begin to adopt an audience-first approach, and the trends we've seen support that. In fact, iSpot TV reported that last year's pharma linear television spend of $3.79 billion actually locked in the lowest year-over-year growth rate since 2014. But of course, we know brands are still spending. So where are the dollars going? And while linear television remains a core component of any DTC strategy, we're also seeing investments shift from digital and emerging platforms. So in today's discussion, we'll explore how the changing ad landscape has affected media channel planning, We'll touch on the role of data and insights, and we'll discuss Pharma's approach to an audience-first strategy from both a DTC and an HCP perspective. So today, I'm delighted to introduce our panelists. I'm joined today by Wally Holloway, Associate Managing Partner at TWA World Health, Paul Manns, Associate Director of Integrated Customer Experience at Merck, and Rekha Yadav, Consultant at Media Services Eli Lilly. Thank you all so much for joining us today. As Charlotte just explained, evolving consumption habits and new media platforms have emerged. This presents both opportunities and challenges for pharma advertisers. And we know consumers want to hear from pharma, especially right now. So let's start there. I'd love to hear from each of our panelists, particularly now in this new normal for all of us. How are you adapting to effectively reach audiences and engage with them in appropriate? Rekha, let's start with you.
Okay, great. No pressure. I go first. No, I think this is a great question. And, I think the sentiment will be universal when I say this is a completely new territory for all of us in society, as well as all of my fellow colleagues and in their respective brands as well. I don't think any veteran alive today, or even, people coming into the workforce now just recently have gone through a pandemic. So the question then really becomes, what can we lean on and what do we do in light of this right now? Like, what information can we grasp at to help sort of inform some of our marketing strategies and how we can sort of steer this forward? So I think for Lilly specifically, what we're doing right now is obviously we're moving very quickly to help address our patients' needs, but from a marketing perspective and specifically from an external media communications perspective, what we're doing is we're trying to sort of pool data sources from different areas to help us assess and come up with a model that we could use to help inform some of our decisioning for the immediate window, as well as for future forward. I think, Lilly being a global company has served us well in the sense that when the outbreak initially occurred in China, we were able to sort of, lean on their sort of learnings in terms of how the pandemic sort of spread to help ascertain and create a proxy model of what we could possibly expect in the US as a starting point to then sort of calibrate our plans accordingly. Since then, obviously, as you can see, there's been a lot of information that even us in the US have been able to lean on. So our partners such as IQVIA, leaning on, again, government, sort of news and outlets, et cetera, to see how states are sort of handling this. We're applying a multivariate approach, I would say, to come up with a model to help inform some of our decisioning. And I think what's key to this right now is that it's not set in stone. It's constantly evolving. So like every couple of weeks, we look at it and we say, okay, does this sort of match in line with what we're seeing from the bottom line perspective as far as NBRX goes or not? Are we seeing an uptick in telehealth? What does that mean for some of our therapeutic areas? How can we sort of leverage that in some of our decision making and leveraging data and insights to inform our plans? So I think, and I'm sure everyone else would probably agree, my fellow colleagues on the panel as well, they're probably enacting similar strategies as well. I think for us, information is what's really key right now, and information that's quick and reliable to help us to inform and pivot quickly as we need to, as far as our media plans go. Is that a great start or no?
It's a fantastic start. Thank you. Paul, I want to shift to you at Merck. How do you see your plans and how are you adapting to reach those audiences?
Sure, I think so. In some sense, it's almost the more things change, the more they stay the same, in the sense that we're always trying to put the customer first and think about what they need. And to me, a lot of it ties into empathy. And so it's just really a matter of thinking, so how have things shifted for the healthcare professional? So I work on the HCP side at Merck. So now that we don't have reps in the office, how does that shift things? Now that sometimes physicians can't have their patients come into the office, I work in oncology, so a lot of those folks have compromised immune systems. So how do you, provide the right materials so that the physician could continue that relationship? It's a lot of that. And again, as Rekha said, really moving very quickly because a lot of this obviously happened extremely quickly. So what programs can we get in the near term that can sort of have that continuity of service to support our field sales support. And then again, it's the contextual relevance. So making sure that we have the right message there for them at the right time. And I think the other thing that's occurred to me too is if this pandemic had occurred in a world without an internet, it would look a lot different. And digital and the internet has helped us stay connected and maintain relationships and grow them in many instances. And so I think there's also a way to, thinking about, how do we continue to nurture those relationships? And then, on the healthcare or the HCP side, we've been battling less and less access for our sales reps. So this has almost accelerated something that in some ways, a lot of us have seen to be years in the future. It happened in the span of a month. So it's also forcing us to think a little bit quicker and think about how we're going to react in that sense too.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I agree with the other panelists. I think it's been unprecedented, this kind of pandemic that we're undergoing, and to your point earlier, it's really impacted the healthcare industry significantly. So to answer your question, it's like there's a couple of different ways that we've approached this in partnership with our clients, and one, first and foremost, is really listening and understanding what new insights can we glean from this. I mean, the good news is, to your point, like patients are continuing to look for information as consumers. They want to know what's out there, and they're looking to pharma, and they're open to pharma communications and messaging during this time. That's the good news. But what we've also noticed is some other interesting insights regarding who they're looking to for sources of information, and it's not just pharma. So I think, our clients and ourselves are having to be really attuned to that. So they're looking to advocacy groups, for example, if they're patients and they're taking medications. They're looking at traditional healthcare sites for information. News, as you mentioned, is a source of information as well. And, pharma sites, they're open to that. They're also looking there. But we often think, well, we should be the first place, especially if there's some healthcare insecurity happening as it relates to treatments and medications. But we're finding some surprises, especially, as it relates to therapeutic categories too. Some patients we're finding are more open to new treatments, and we're finding some patients are less. So I think the result of the pandemic on the patient side is kind of manifest in a couple of different ways. And the insights that we're able to glean from that are really helping to guide those strategies. On the HCP side, I think one of the things that's really come to the forefront is, we've always known this. There are primary targets on the pharma side, but they're people too. So, as we've done a lot of surveys with HCPs, it's been really interesting to understand more about, what they're going through during this time. And a lot of their concerns match the patients, like a lot of, concern about the health of their patients, the health of themselves and their families and their practices. So again, I think it all kind of starts with listening, because it all goes back at the end of the day to being authentic and relevant to them. And also I think, in partnership with pharma, they've really recognized that it's important to match be sensitive to the cadence and the tone and the type of message during this time as well.
So I want to tap into that. So you or mentioned in terms of the right message. So how do you see clients, and from Paul and Reka, from you as well on the client side, how are you adjusting the messaging to ensure that it's the correct messaging during this time, yet still speaking directly to patients, to consumers? How has creative messaging changed?
Well,
Reka,
I would say that, again, oh, sorry, go ahead.
You go ahead, Wally.
Okay. I was going to say that the rules still apply in terms of the right message at the right time. And, I would say that, really thinking and being thoughtful about the approach with the kinds of things that are really important to these patients, and making sure that the type of messaging that shows up to them really does, first and foremost, address their specific personal needs around treatment, healthcare, and security, and making sure that we're sensitive to that. So, it's not about, for patients, just talking at them and telling them what we want them to hear, but it's also making sure that we know what they're going through, especially in this time of the pandemic. That's really been critical.
For some of the products I work on, we have a competitive advantage in a certain sense where we offer oral dosing. And so when we're trying to keep people out of the office, it's worth pointing out to our physicians. And then I think the other piece too is also the cadence. So there can be a reflex to just bump up the volume across all of these channels. And we've been very intentional about not doing that, and about making sure that between, whether it's the rep or sort of the non-personal side, that we're being even more careful to coordinate that so we're not overwhelming our physicians.
Yeah, and I think the last thing I would probably add to both of my fellow panelists' points is the fact that, you know, at no time has our purpose been greater, right, as a pharmaceutical company, to really live and breathe what we stand for. And Lily, to that regard, you know, across all of our therapeutic areas, we are taking a second lens to make sure our messaging is still, you know, in tune with what's happening right now. Because the last thing you want to do is obviously be tone deaf. And in addition to that, we're also creating a pipeline of, you know, just unique, dedicated sort of creative assets for contingent upon each therapeutic area relevant to those, but how we can sort of communicate with patients out there, especially as we think about the massive, you know, unemployment rate that we have right now. Affordability obviously is going to be a big theme as we think about whether or not patients can even afford those messages, you know, so how can we actually push, you know, efforts that we already had in place, right? This is not necessarily new. Again, it comes back to being authentic to what we stand for. It's more about putting that out. So yes, we have all of these programs in place, but how can we make them more visible to people who really need it right now? And I think those are some of the discussions we're having internally at the organization, while making sure, you know, current advertising and messaging that's already at play is still on point and not necessarily turning patients off in light of COVID.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And along those lines, you know, you're mentioning ensuring that the message is relevant. Are you seeing digital platforms, emerging platforms, anything shifting from television to ensure you're reaching that right consumer with that right message?
If that's directed at me, sure, I'll answer. So again, yes, we aren't making seismic sort of moves right now, but we are sort of fine-tuning and trying to make sure we are where people are right now again. And so to that end, as part of Lily's digital manifesto, you know, a journey that we embarked on a couple of years ago in terms of digital transformation, we are constantly being litmus tested on how we can sort of apply that even in today's climate right now. And, you know, based on decisions happening internally, we are sort of re-examining to a certain degree our efforts right now in terms of, you know, where should we sort of apply our dollars to the best sort of our ability. And in certain instances, we are making some adjustments, but I wouldn't necessarily say we're making any seismic shifts right now. I think that the larger sort of application of that would probably come for upfront planning, to be perfectly honest, in terms of the longer term view, in terms of how do we sort of assign our marketing efforts for the upcoming broadcast year. And I think that's a relevant conversation that we're having internally as well.
Great. So the underpinning of nearly everything we've just covered so far is data and insights. And we've been seeing this as a trend, pharma and other verticals really pushing towards that audience-based world. So I want to specifically hear from each of you on how the role of data is filing into your consumer or your HCP marketing strategy. Where are you really seeing the importance of data today?
Sure. So I can jump on that. I think for those that to work outside of pharma, if they knew how much data we have, they'd be incredibly jealous. And as somebody had pointed out a while ago, we're rooted in data, right? Medicine at its core is science, which is data. It all comes from that. So the industry has more data than we know what to do with sometimes. We're looking at prescribing habits at the actual physician level, the use of diagnostic tests, and parsing that with digital behavior, and looking in many instances to try and determine sort of where physicians are along the spectrum of being aware of a product and then starting to use it, and then hopefully becoming a loyalist or, you know, a high prescriber at the end of the day. So I would say those, you know, the diagnostic claims, the prescriptions, you know, the RX data, and then the digital behavior data, it sounds sort of, I think, simple to just bucket it under those three categories, but within that, there are many, many layers and many things that I think can be inferred. I think when we think about digital, we also, as people, and I think as digital marketers, we probably see this or maybe recognize this more than other folks, but we create an enormous amount of what I like to call digital exhaust. And so there's all these little signs and signals that lay everywhere based on how we interact with websites and social media platforms and many other things out there in the world. And we can pull those signals in and start to really get a sense of where each of our targets are at. So on one hand, there's a plethora of data, but then the other piece becomes how can you act on it? It can be very challenging at the enterprise level to pull all that data together effectively and then act on it. So I think, you know, that's probably one of the biggest challenges that I run into right now is how can we have all this data? How can you get it quickly enough, act on it quickly enough? How can it be salient? Because the great data that's 3 years old, that might as well be prehistoric. So how do we, you know, keep the data coming in and acting on it as quickly as possible so that you have that timely, you know, engagement with your target?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely critical. And, you know, to Paul's point, you know, pharma has a lot of data, and I think, you know, we as an industry continues to be challenged with how best to use it. I think, you know, just on the HCP space, there's a real opportunity for us to create more kind of customized experiences for those customers. And I think the digital channels that, you know, we're considering more and more of based on what's happening with the pandemic are going to be increasingly important. I mean, we know our HCP customers, which are our primary target for pharma, are under an incredible amount of pressure, right? Patient care, time management, payer pressure. So I think the opportunity for us to leverage the data in a way that makes sure that we can serve up the right message at the right time is going to be really critical for physicians who are currently busy, under a lot of pressure, and will continue to be. And I also think that leveraging data so that we're also thinking about kind of the spectrum of channels that are going to be most useful with HCPs is also important. Of course, it always was, and I think even now more so, because as we look at one of the main channels that pharma uses in terms of sales reps, that's changing a bit now, right, in the midst of the pandemic. So I think that the opportunity for pharma is to really rethink that. Many of our clients are like, what does that look like in the future? And I think it's going to be important for us to really recognize, you know, where do we see the world going in relation to the channels that we're using? It's putting an incredible amount of focus on digital channels with sales reps being home. But I think it's going to be really important to make sure in the face of this, you know, what does that look like in the future? And how do we make sure that we maximize data across digital channels to make sure that they get the right message? And we're doing that appropriately in concert with personal promotion channels.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, one piece that Paul and Wally, you don't have to consider as much being on the HCP side is HIPAA regulation, right? Which applies to personal health information. So Rekha, I'd love to hear from you, since pharma is obviously very regulated. How does data play a role for you specifically on the consumer side?
Right, and that's exactly what I was thinking in the back of my mind as my fellow panelists were speaking. So yes, absolutely, from a DTC perspective, Paul's point is still universal, right? If anything, I would think we have data paralysis even on the DTC side. There's just so much data, and I guess for me personally, it's more about, well, what kind of data do we want to necessarily utilize? What should rise to the top in terms of making some of our decisions as far as media investments move forward? I think, you know, as it relates to our current state as well as maybe, you know, next year and thereafter, one of the most critical questions that we're challenged with right now and that we're looking to solve for is the impending CCPA implementation, you know, come about a year or so and change. And what does that look like, you know, when when the industry has spent, you know, a decade or more on cookie-based advertising, and companies that, you know, ad tech companies have sort of, you know, been built on that. What does that sort of world look like now as we think about, you know, privacy guidelines, and how can we actually leverage more perhaps on our first party data, because we have that, and how do we actually look towards maybe partnerships so we can have secure transferences from data to create, you know, maybe unique walled garden situations for ourselves moving forward. So I think it'll be really interesting, and it's something that we're working with in concert with our agency, of course. But as far as a long-term view goes, I think the critical piece here would be the CCPA guidelines, and what does that look like from a DTC perspective about a year and a half from now. Mallory, I think you may have frozen. Okay.
There. Hi, we're back. So I think I missed the last part, but actually a question just came in that I think might make sense to ask now rather than waiting for Q&A. The question is, how would you suggest agencies help clients accelerate their efforts with data during this time?
So one of the things that we've begun to implement with our agency of record is to have concerted weekly conversations and weekly meetings where there's a lot of knowledge sharing. And it stems anywhere from things that are happening at a government level. So a great example being all of the relaxations that are happening on a state-by-state level. And what does that look like in terms of our varying therapeutic areas and how the business models look like, in addition to just, industry white papers or industry sort of announcements, et cetera, coming in. So we've made a concerted effort to have weekly sort of discussions about this right now, and how could that feed into our model as of today or tomorrow in terms of pivoting our plans. So I think for me, what's most critical is not being restricted to our data sources that we may have subscribed to yesterday pre-COVID. I think right now we've cast a pretty wide blanket in terms of informing some of our efforts, and our agency partner has been great about it. They've been pulling information from all different areas just to see if it sparks an idea or if it gives us another point of consideration in terms of our efforts right now. But I think what's critical, what's been helping us right now is really sort of being really quick about it and being very, very clear about what the information means. So that's, while it obviously takes a little bit of extra effort, I think having those weekly discussions with our agency partners and that constant sort of two-way information sharing has been working for us so far.
Sure. So at Merck, we have a creative agency, and then we also use an analytics partner who we rely pretty heavily on for some of our data analysis. And I think, so part of it is the ability of them to help us execute ad hocs very quickly, which they do a great job of. And then I feel like the other part of that too is sometimes looking at the data and trying to take one or two steps back and see what the data might not be telling us overtly. So are there some dimensions of the data where you could say, well, if they have this, does that actually tell you something about the way the customer's thinking? If I write this, does that, okay, so it's clear that they write that, but maybe that says something about their belief in a certain line of therapy or the way they approach treatment. And then once you understand that belief, what's the thing that you do to change that? Because messaging directly might not be as advantageous as taking a step back. And then so if we can find those sort of stories behind the data and then work with our creative agency to think about how we build some great creative that works against shifting that mindset, I think there's a lot of power there. And then obviously, doing it as quickly as possible, because as things shift and evolve, there's a lot of, I don't like to work reactively, but we are working a little bit reactively. And then as it's been pointed out too, we're going to have different areas of the country that are reacting differently. So there might be certain centers of the country that open up more quickly, and there's a way to think about how they're sort of showing up versus some of the other areas that are going to be sheltered in place longer, and how do we show up there? I think that's important as well.
Wally, any thoughts on your end?
No, I completely agree. I think that it's going to be important that, as Paul said, kind of working from our point of view, really thinking about based on the variances and where, again, patients and consumers and HCPs, quite frankly, are looking for information, making sure that we can take those insights and turn that into creative that's very relevant for them.
One more great question that just came in along the lines of digital and creative messaging and the appropriate platforms. Can you share some insight on what digital sites have worked best for you and how the breakout is between search, premium content, and then digital streaming services like CTV? Not to throw this on anyone. Any thoughts?
So I speaking from my experience, again, sort of on the HCP side, somebody mentioned this earlier, by the time they get to the pharma website, they've probably already made a treatment decision and they're there for some very specific resources. So what we've learned is that having a robust ecosystem of content that lies well beyond that is where the treatment decisions or some of the opinions are going to be made. And so we look to a suite of partners. Many, I'm not going to get into specifics here, but many of the folks out there would be familiar with them, that do a great job of providing the relevant content, and I think give a lot of creative flexibility as well for us to show up the way we'd like to show up. That gives us the opportunity to educate physicians and provide them, with the tools and resources to make the best treatment decisions for their patients.
Yeah, and I think from a DTC perspective, it's not so much after the fact, it's more about the pre-planning phase. So going in by design, like how do we want to make sure we're communicating with our patients at the right time and the right place? And journey mapping is a big piece of it. So it's not so much looking at it from the end point in terms of what digital sites may not have worked well for us. But obviously, we have data to sort of back that up and sort of refine, and the cycle continues. But I think the way we try to address it first and foremost is to really take a concerted effort to understand our patient profile and who this person is and how do we want to communicate with them, and then design the plan accordingly to that. To that end, again, without necessarily giving away some specifics, we, once a plan is active in market, we obviously sort of put a check on it and see how it's performing. What we've noticed is not so much a specific publisher or partner, it's more about the right message being aligned with the right content. So it's more of a content play versus, a contextual sort of end touch point. As long as the messaging and the media sort of marry and align properly, we've seen some positive results on our end.
And from our standpoint, I mean, what's really exciting right now, as I mentioned earlier, is, as we're thinking about reaching our target physicians and patients in newer ways based on the fact that digital is becoming more and more important, and what that channel mix looks like is even more important for us to evaluate. I think that from a creative standpoint, we're really focused on two things: the ecosystem, and then what are the stories that we tell on those platforms that are truly native, right? So that it feels like it's relevant and it matches the platform, and that the messaging and our content strategy really are able to be developed so that it really matches the channel and the platform and the medium.
Definitely. So a little bit on the HCP, but I also want to touch consumer here, kind of combination of a thought we had earlier and then a question that just came through is obviously everyone's adjusting to the new normal. HCPs are not receiving pharmaceutical visits as much. Obviously the sales force is at home like the rest of us. And the question specifically is, how are you addressing strategies and messaging around the current situation where treatments may be hindered due to our current status on the consumer side? So how are you speaking to patients directly? And then Paul, perhaps Wally on the HCP side, how are you rethinking doctor education, knowing that the pharmaceutical reps simply cannot go visit these doctors face to face?
Go ahead. Or I can take that.
All right, go ahead, Rika.
So I'll start off with the DTC piece. I think that question is more for what we would deem as below the line efforts. It's not so much what I would have oversight or what my primary remit is, which is obviously external communications. I think Lilly as an organization right now, we have teams at place internally within our company that are really thinking about, to your point, like how do we get that message out? Like how do we communicate with them? And it's more about our sort of non-mass advertising channels that we're tapping into right now to make sure that those are sort of, well-oiled and well-calibrated. I think, making sure, for example, there's been a lot of discussion and work behind some of our websites, et cetera, in terms of making sure that we're there when people search for our medications, and affordability, as I think I alluded to earlier, has been a recurring issue we really push out, and that Lilly is here to help sort of, serve those needs and find a way to help get patients their medications that they need. I think as it relates to DTC specifically for above the line, mass advertising efforts, that question is more about, from a longer term view, how do we actually make sure we're, again, not trying to be tone deaf here, but how are we making sure we're still there where we need to be? But for this specific question, I think it's more about below the line efforts we've already been doing, till date. How do we push that out even more to make sure there's awareness of those programs in place?
From an HCP perspective, we've come across actually a couple of partners. Folks have just reached out on LinkedIn, and we're looking at a couple of partners that offer the opportunity to do almost like any detail. There's some partners who, if you're familiar with the concept of the core visual aid, the rep, walks in and has a notion of what he wants to focus on with the physician on his sales call, and then might leave the paper aid, or they use a e-detail. But we've actually found, so we have some partners that can make that happen in 60 seconds or less. And then obviously we have the full end of the other spectrum, which is the rep hopefully getting 3 minutes of the physician's time. And we found a couple partners that have the opportunity to build something that lives in the middle, that collects the data, so we can actually see what part of the story the physician might have dropped off at, so you could get a sense of, is this part of our message not, perhaps as interesting as it should be. But I think one of the most powerful things with this is that if the physician, let's say they get off a shift at 10 o'clock at night and they're flipping through something, the rep's not going to be there to detail them. But if they have this piece of content there, they can get the gist of it. And it kind of decouples a little bit that dependence upon the rep. And I think the other thing too is, if you think about it, there used to be the opportunity to run into them in the practice setting. And without that being there, you're relying upon trying to get an email to get an appointment, to get some time, and then you hope that it doesn't get canceled. And we all go through scheduling conflicts on a daily basis. So the rep, as a lower priority for the physician, there's always just trying to get that calendar coordination is brutal. So building that content that they can access sort of on demand. And then I think also thinking about that bite snack meal concept of, can you have the 60 seconds of content that might fill a small need? And can you build a relationship to the point where we can get them in front of something that might be a 20-minute program that is rep-led, right? But generate that interest and get them engaged so that we can have their attention for a longer span of time. That's really, I think, where it's headed. And again, trying to find that filler gap. And I think the other thing to consider is what happens, we've all figured out that working from home, a lot of us can do it, right? And certain companies in the past week have announced that you're never going to need to come back into the office. So what if health systems say, we don't need to allow reps back in, like they don't actually, like there's a lot of issues, just from a pure sanitation perspective that could be mitigated. So what if the reps are never allowed back in? What does that new normal evolve to? So I think there's some opportunities there to think about, what does that look like, that new digital norm from a rep perspective.
If there's anything I've garnered from this discussion, I think we could have a whole nother panel just talking about how can data and emerging platforms reach patients specifically, or just reach doctors. So one quick question I want to hear from everyone before we close. Looking on the horizon, what do you think is the greatest opportunity for growth in pharma advertising?
So I'll kick it off the way out. I've long believed that customer experience and really thinking about what the customer needs and putting that first, sort of the if you build it, they will come mindset, it's been shown to work. And so I think really putting yourself in the mindset of the customer and thinking about the content that they're going to need and how we can meet that need. And then of course that leads to the channel selection and all those very specific pieces, but I think continue to keep that top of mind. It's not easy to do. So that's, to me, the greatest opportunity moving.
And from my perspective, I think that the greatest opportunity is really looking to new technologies. I mean, in the pharma space, we've done, I feel like, a great job at reaching our customers through multiple different channels and platforms. And, we dabbled a bit in kind of what do some of the new technologies really offer, our ability to target patients or HCPs. I think now's the time. I've been saying in the past few weeks that COVID and the pandemic was kind of a bellwether event, I think, for our industry in many ways, for the patients, because they're thinking about, what does this mean for me in the short term and the long term? And there's kind of three areas to that. There's kind of self-care. There's there's about, significant, really, how do we help populations get better care? They're focused on that. And I think also for pharma, new technologies are really going to come to the forefront more now than ever before. I think, in addition to, accessing physicians and patients, AR technology is another one that we're really focused on at our agency. Conferences are being canceled, right? That may also be something that we see in the future becomes more of the norm, because we find out that can happen. So how do we employ things like AR technology, green screen technology, to bring the conferences into people's homes or on their mobile screens or in their offices, so they really do get a real experience that they're there. So I think that, partnering with clients to think about what else is possible, we've been doing that for a long time, but I think now is the time for pharma companies to really think about, in this new environment, what else really look like?
I couldn't agree with Paul and Wally any more than this, but just to use that quote that I've been sort of using internally with my fellow colleagues, you know, necessity is the mother of invention. And if there's any sort of silver lining to this pandemic right now is the creativity that it can breed in terms of how we sort of re-examine and give ourselves permission really to break the rules a little bit and to rewrite the script in terms of, you know, how we want to push out DTC advertising and communication moving forward. So personally for me, I'm excited about that specific aspect of it in terms of how we can shape our communications moving forward. But you know, to Wally's point, what are those new technologies, or you know, how do we maybe just, you know, flip existing touch points on its head and see, rethink about how we want to maybe execute in that area. I think it breeds a lot of sort of you know, opportunity for us internally as well as with our agency partners to really think about, you know, what do we want, you know, our future to be as a company, and sort of to that end, keeping in line with our digital manifesto, what does the next 2-3 years look like post-pandemic? What is this new normal? How has media evolved as a result of it? And how we need to shift our communication. So personally, I'm excited to see what comes out of this right now. Obviously, you know, our most pertinent concern right now is making sure everyone is healthy and safe. But I think from, you know, just an external advertising perspective, I think you know, there's a lot of opportunity with upfront specifically being top of mind right now. We're really rethinking how we want to maybe approach the market for that specifically.
Great. Well, thank you all again. Thanks to our amazing panelists, Reka, Wally, and Paul for joining us today. It was very interesting to hear your thoughts on how pharma marketers can use data, how do we navigate this new normal, and really appreciate your time. So Gina, with that, I'll pass it back to you.
Yes, I echo the sentiment. I think the conversation today was so smart and so timely. And I think there's a part of all of us that's excited about the opportunities. That is the silver lining of this pandemic. There's a lot that's going to come on the forefront that is forcing us as a community to look at. And I think that that could be a positive thing. Thank you, Xandr. Thank you, all the panelists. On behalf of the Ad Club, we wish everybody that's listening a safe holiday weekend and try to kick back a little bit and enjoy. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks.